Before we begin, drop a comment below with your country and what time it is right now where you're watching. Whether it's sunrise in Nairobi, midnight in New York, afternoon in Canada, or evening in France. I want to know. Don't just sit back. Tell me where in the world you are. Now, let's dive into the story. 7 men buried him alive before the sun came up. By the time it set, they would all wish they hadn't. The first thing Caleb Dern felt was weight, not pain, not yet, just the slow, deliberate pressure of dry Nevada earth pressing down on his chest, like a man who had decided to take his time killing you. The sky above Harrow Flat was bruised purple at the edges, barely past dawn, and the last thing Caleb had seen before the first shovelful hit his face was Elias Creed standing at the rim of the hole, adjusting the white cuffs of his shirt as though this were a business matter being neatly concluded. There were 7 of them up there, 7 men with rifles, horses, and no mercy whatsoever. They had dragged Caleb 3 miles from his own cabin, bound at the wrists with rawhide that had already cut down to bone, and they had dug the hole before he arrived, which told him one thing with absolute clarity. This had not been decided in anger. This had been planned over dinner, over whiskey, with men nodding calmly around a table while Caleb slept under his own roof, not yet knowing his grave was already being shaped from the earth he had farmed for 6 years. They did not say much. That was the part that would haunt Harrow Flat later, when people tried to make sense of what followed. Elias Creed spoke exactly 9 words. He looked down into the hole at Caleb's bloodied face and said, "The water rights transfer to me at first light." Then he nodded to Sheriff Garrett Voss, who stood 2 feet to his left gripping a long-handled shovel, and Garrett began filling the hole without a word, without hesitation, without a single shift in his expression. Caleb tried to speak. His mouth was already thick with grit, his arms pinned beneath him at angles that would have been unbearable if terror hadn't flooded out every other sensation entirely. He heard the other men mount their horses. He heard the low creak of leather saddles settling under weight. He heard the first horse begin to walk, then canter, then gallop, and then the second, and the third, until all he could hear was Garrett Voss's steady breathing, the rhythmic scrape of iron on dirt, and the growing darkness pressing down over his face like the lid of something being sealed forever. What they did not account for was the arroyo. 6 years earlier, when Caleb first walked this land, he had spent 3 days mapping every dry gulch, every underground seam, every place where the desert had cracked open and revealed its own hidden skeleton. He had done this not out of paranoia, but out of deep bone-bred habit, the kind built into a man who has survived. The Rockies alone, who has outlasted 3 winters above the snowline, with nothing but a skinning knife and knowledge of which direction roots grow in frozen ground. The hole Voss had dug sat directly above a collapsed arroyo channel, a hollow cavity in the sandstone no bigger than a wagon bed, running roughly east beneath the scrubland. Caleb had known it was there because he had fallen into its sunken cousin twice while working that stretch of land in his first year. He had never told anyone. There was no reason to. But now, in the total dark, with the weight of earth compressing his lungs and the last of the oxygen turning sour, that forgotten knowledge was the only thing standing between him and the permanent end of his story. He pressed his bound hands downward into the loose earth beneath him, and the floor gave way. He dropped maybe 4 feet, no more. But those 4 feet were the full distance between buried and alive. He hit the floor of the cavity hard, shoulder first, and lay in absolute blackness for a time he could not measure, breathing in shallow, ragged pulls, tasting blood and limestone dust and something faintly metallic he decided not to think about. Above him, the earth settled, compressed by its own weight, sealing the hole as neatly as if Voss had spent an hour tamping it flat. The men were gone. The horses were gone. Harrow Flat would wake up in an hour, cook its breakfasts, open its shop doors, and not ask a single question about where Caleb Dern had gone, because Elias Creed owned Harrow Flat the way other men own pocket watches, completely and without sentiment. Caleb pressed his back against the cold stone wall of the cavity and began working the rawhide against a sharp limestone edge he found purely by touch in the dark. His wrist bled freely. He kept working. He did not think about revenge in that hollow place beneath the ground. That would come later, in forms that would cost him sleep and cost others far more. What he thought about was a girl named Wren, 8 years old, hair the color of dry wheat, the only living thing on this earth that Caleb Dern had ever truly been afraid to lose. She was in Harrow Flat right now, boarding at Mila Oakes's house on Crane Street, waiting for her father to come back from what he had told her was a quick check of the fence line. She had asked him not to go in the dark. She had stood at the cabin door in her wool socks and said, "Pa, something feels wrong tonight." He had kissed the top of her head and told her she worried too much. Now he lay beneath 6 feet of Nevada dirt and understood she'd been completely right, and that the only reason his survival mattered, the only reason it meant anything at all, was that he was going to walk out of this ground and back to her. Everything else was secondary. The men who buried him would learn that lesson in full, but first he had to get out, and what he was about to find in the dark would change the shape of everything that followed. 6 years earlier, Caleb Dern had arrived in the valley below Harrow Flat on a horse that was more scar than animal, with a 2-year-old girl asleep against his chest, and everything he owned in 2 saddlebags and a bedroll tied behind the saddle. Nobody in town marked his arrival. Men moved through Harrow Flat like dust on a good day, and like nothing at all on a bad one, and Caleb was just another drifter until the morning he walked into the land office and put down coin for the stretch of high desert scrubland sitting 6 miles south of town along the eastern bank of Brindleback Creek. The clerk, a thin man named Fowler with ink-stained fingers and a permanent squint, looked at the deed, then at Caleb, then at the deed again. "You know that land backs up to the only reliable water source in 30 miles, Fowler said slowly. Caleb said nothing. He folded the deed into his breast pocket, picked up Wren from the wooden chair where she slept, with her thumb in her mouth, and walked out into the Nevada sun without another word. He had not come to Harrow Flat to make conversation. He had come to build something that could not be taken. The cabin had taken 4 months to build properly. Caleb did it entirely alone, logging ponderosa pine from the ridgeline and shaping stone from the creek bed for the foundation. He built the walls thick enough to hold cold out in winter and heat out in summer. He built the fireplace wide enough to cook on one side and warm the room on the other. He built Wren's bedroom before he built his own, a small room with a south-facing window so she would always wake to light. And when the rains came that first November and the roof held without leaking a single drop, he sat at the table in the dark and felt something he had not felt in years. Peace. He had not experienced much of it in his 42 years on this earth. His childhood had been a series of cold rooms and hard silences. His years, in the mountains before Wren had been survival, nothing more. But this land, this creek, this small cabin where a little girl slept dreaming things he would never fully know, this felt, for the first time, like something genuinely his, like ground that would not move beneath him no matter what pressed down on it. Wren's mother had died on the trail from Colorado. Her name was Addie, and she had been the kind of woman who laughed at unexpected moments and cried at unexpected ones, and who had seen something in Caleb that he could never quite identify in himself. She died of a fever 3 days west of the Nevada border, and Caleb buried her alone beside a juniper tree with no marker, because there was nothing in the saddlebags that could serve as one. He held Wren on his lap for the next 2 days of riding and said almost nothing. But from that moment, something shifted in him like a plate of earth settling deep underground. He had always been a quiet man. After Addie, he became a silent one, except for Wren. For Wren, he talked. He narrated the landscape. He named every bird. He made up bedtime stories about wolves that turned into horses and rivers that ran uphill. He was not soft by nature, but for her, he learned how to be gentle, and that single effort cost him more than anything he had ever done with his hands. By the 3rd year on Brindleback Creek, word had spread quietly through Harrow Flat that the mountain man on the southern land was no ordinary settler. He had water, not a trickle but real, reliable year-round flow from an underground spring that fed the creek even through the dry months when every other source in the valley turned to cracked mud and quiet desperation. 3 nearby ranchers had approached him about access rights, and he had worked out fair arrangements with each: reasonable fees, shared maintenance of the channel banks, clear boundaries written in plain language both parties fully understood. The town respected him for it. In the distant nodding way, Harrow Flat respected any man who asked nothing and caused no visible trouble. He was not social and did not pretend to be. He went to town only for supplies, collected wren from Mila Oaks on school evenings, and rode the 6 miles back through the cooling dark with wren pressed warm against his back, talking the whole way home about every small thing her day had contained. Every bird, every lesson, every word her teacher said that she had decided mattered. Elias Creed did not respect Caleb Dern. Creed had arrived in the valley 8 years before Caleb with money from somewhere nobody asked about and an appetite for land that had no visible floor. He owned the stockyards, the hotel, the general store, and 3 of the 5 cattle operations in the county. He owned Sheriff Garrett Voss, which meant he owned the law itself. He owned the bank that held paper on half the town's properties, which meant he owned the choices those people believed were freely their own, choices that were, in truth, entirely shaped by what Creed permitted them to make. In Harrow Flat, Elias Creed was not a man so much as a weather system, something that shaped everything around it, something you learn to account for the way you account for wind and cold and the particular dark that settles over a valley before a hard storm arrives. Caleb had built his life trying to stay below that weather. For 6 years, it had worked. Then the drought came, and the creek on his land became the most valuable thing in the county, and Creed stopped being patient. And what Creed did next, the quiet, methodical way he began dismantling everything Caleb had built, was something no one in Harrow Flat would ever fully forget. The first time Elias Creed made his offer, it was polite. He sent a man named Jasper Old to the cabin on a Sunday morning, well-dressed, clean boots, carrying a folded letter that smelled of tobacco and expensive wood. Caleb had been splitting kindling in the yard when the rider appeared on the south trail. He read the letter once, handed it back to Jasper without a word, and went back to splitting. Jasper stood there for a moment, confused in the way men are confused when they encounter someone who genuinely does not want what money is offering them. The letter had contained a generous figure, the kind that would have made most men in Harrow Flat weep openly with relief. Caleb put his boot on a piece of pine, split it cleanly down the center, and did not look up again until Jasper's horse was gone from the trail entirely. That evening, he sat on the porch, while Wren ran barefoot in the creek shallows below, shrieking at the cold water, her wheat-colored hair loose in the last light. He watched her and understood with complete clarity that no figure on any letter could buy what he was looking at. Some things have a price, some things are simply yours. The second offer came 3 weeks later, and it was not polite. Creed came himself this time, riding in with 2 men behind him, and the particular expression of a man who considers every conversation a negotiation he has already won before it begins. He dismounted in the yard and looked at the cabin and the creek and the garden and Caleb's small corral the way you look at something you already own and are simply waiting to collect. Caleb had been mending a harness on the porch steps. He did not stand. He did not offer water. He looked at Creed with the flat, unreadable expression of a stone wall observing weather. Creed said the figure had been reconsidered and was now considerably higher. Caleb said the land was not for sale at any figure. Creed smiled, not warmly, but with the recognition of finding exactly the resistance he expected. "Every man has a price, Mr. Dern," he said. Caleb held his gaze and said quietly, "Then mine is higher than you." Creed rode out without another word, but he looked back at the cabin once, before turning his horse, a long, comprehensive look that covered the entire property. And that look was a promise written in a language that needed no translation. The winter that followed was the beginning of the end of Caleb's peace, though he could not have named it that at the time. Small things started happening. A fence line cut by wire cutters, not animals. His arrangement with the Healy Ranch fell apart after Healy abruptly stopped needing creek access and would not meet Caleb's eye in town. 2 tools went missing from the shed. Nothing provable. Nothing that would survive a conversation with Sheriff Voss. Meanwhile, on school days, when Wren boarded with Mila Oakes on Crane Street, Caleb would ride the 6 miles to town and collect her in the evening, and she would climb onto the horse behind him and press her face into his back and talk the entire way home. Every small thing that had happened, every word her teacher said, every bird she had seen from the classroom window. Those evening rides were the best hours of his week, and he held on to them the way a man holds a lamp in a darkening room, knowing the dark is pressing in from every side and choosing to hold the light anyway. What Caleb did not know was that Creed had changed his approach entirely. He had stopped trying to buy the land and started buying the people around it, one by one, quietly, with the patience that had always been his most dangerous quality. Fowler at the land office, a debt quietly forgiven. The 2 ranchers with water agreements pressured steadily through the bank. Mila Oakes's landlord, who housed Wren during school days, 3 months of back rent disappeared in exchange for a brief, agreeable conversation. Every person in Caleb's small orbit had been assessed, pressured, and turned, not through violence, but through the soft and suffocating weight of obligation and carefully managed fear. By the time Creed prepared his final move, Caleb Dern was more isolated than he had ever been. The creek still ran. The cabin still stood. Wren still ran barefoot in the shallows when the light was right, but the world around all of it had been quietly hollowed out, and Caleb was standing on ground that looked completely solid and was not. The final move was not another offer. It came at dusk on a Tuesday, Sheriff Garrett Voss riding alone to the cabin, sitting his horse in the yard with his hat pushed back, delivering in a flat, rehearsed voice the exact words Creed had given him. "Mr. Creed thinks you might be putting your little girl at risk, keeping her out here with all the trouble that's been happening. He wanted you to know he's concerned." He looked directly at Wren, who stood at the porch rail in her dress and boots, watching the sunset paint the ridge in deep orange and red. Then Voss looked back at Caleb. Then he rode away without waiting for any response. That night, after Wren fell asleep, Caleb sat at the table in the dark for a long time. They had mentioned her. They had looked at his daughter and spoken her name without saying it. He had been prepared to absorb pressure on himself without limit. But that look, deliberate, calculated, aimed at the most important thing in his world, changed the mathematics of everything. Something in Caleb went very still, in the way truly dangerous things go still just before they move. He did not sleep that night, and what he decided before dawn would set everything that followed into permanent, irreversible motion. The night they took him, Caleb made a mistake, and he knew it was a mistake even as he was making it. A rider, young, thin, breathing hard, appeared at the cabin door near midnight with a story about livestock breaking through the eastern fence onto Caleb's waterland. Could he come out with a lantern and help sort it before they trampled the creek bank? The story had 7 small holes in it before the rider finished his second sentence. "The wrong name for the fence line. A breed of cattle no ranch east of Harrow Flat kept. Boots far too clean for a man who had been chasing animals through dark scrubland." Caleb had seen every one of those holes. He had also made a calculation. If he refused, and the story somehow held a grain of truth, it gave Creed something to bring to Voss. If he went, he could at least see exactly what he was walking into before they thought he was ready. He told himself this was strategy. The truth, which he admitted to himself much later lying beneath the ground, was simpler and harder. He was tired of waiting in the cabin while the walls closed in. He had wanted to finally see what they would do when they stopped pretending. He had misjudged precisely how far they were prepared to go. They had him in the first 200 yards. 6 men stepped from the scrubland with rifles already raised, and the young rider dropped his lantern pretense and drew his own gun before Caleb had time to fully process how completely the trap had closed. Someone had planned this carefully. Someone had rehearsed it. The choreography was too clean, too practiced, which meant it had been ready for weeks, waiting only for the right moment to spring. He did not fight, not because he couldn't, but because 6 rifles at close range is not a situation that fist-fighting resolves, and because the one calculation that overrode everything else was this: Wren was asleep alone in the cabin 3 miles back, and the only way he could do anything meaningful about that was to stay alive long enough to act on it. He let them bind his wrists, he let them put him on a horse, and he began moving through the arithmetic of the situation with the patient, unhurried clarity that had kept him alive in places considerably more dangerous than a Nevada night. They did not speak to him on the 3-mile ride. He recognized 2 of the men. Cutter Main, Creed's chief hired hand seen twice before, both times, standing at Creed's side, both times watching everything with the still, counting expression of a man who never stops measuring exits and outcomes. And Deputy Holt Voss, Garrett's younger brother, riding at the back of the group, hat low, never looking directly at Caleb during the entire ride. That detail caught Caleb's attention and held it firmly. Guilt looks a specific way on a man who has never been present at a killing before, but is about to be something borrowed and ill-fitting, like clothes belonging to someone else entirely. Holt Voss wore that expression the entire 3 miles, and Caleb filed it carefully in the part of his mind reserved for things that might be useful when circumstances changed. Then the horses stopped. In the gray pre-dawn light, he saw the hole, already dug, already deep, already waiting with the patience of something that had been prepared well in advance. When Elias Creed spoke his 9 words and nodded to Garrett Voss, Caleb looked at him without hatred, and he saw that this surprised Creed, saw the slight involuntary pause in the man's composed certainty. What Caleb felt in that moment was not hatred. It was grief, not for himself, but for Wren, who would wake in the cabin and find him gone, and who would spend years not knowing what had happened or why. He thought about her wool socks on the cold cabin floor, the way she tipped her chin up when she was trying hard not to cry. The watermelon garden she had asked him to plant along the south side of the creek, they were going to do it together in spring. She had already picked the exact spot and pointed at it with one serious finger. He was going to plant that garden. He made himself that promise, with the dirt hitting his face and the darkness pressing in, and Garrett Voss breathing steadily above him like a man completing an ordinary chore before breakfast. He pressed his hands into the earth beneath him and felt the hollow give of the cavity floor, and something locked and purposeful and completely cold settled over his heart. The rawhide took 20 minutes to work through, 20 minutes of pressing bound wrists against a sharp limestone edge he found entirely by touch in the absolute dark, blood making everything slippery and the cracked floor of the cavity offering nothing solid to brace against. He counted his breathing to keep panic completely out, 4 counts in, 4 counts out, the same rhythm he had used when trapped in a snowpack in the Bitterroots at 26, when survival had been the only permitted thought and every other thought was a luxury he could not afford at any price. When the rawhide finally gave and his hands came apart, he lay still for exactly 10 seconds and listened to the sealed world above. Nothing. Not even wind. Harrow Flat had buried him, covered him over, and moved on without a single pause. He thought of Wren waking up. Wren at the cabin door in her wool socks, chin tipped up, leaning, slightly forward into hope the way she always did when she was waiting for him. He got to his feet in the dark, and what he did in the next 36 hours, before anyone in Harrow Flat knew he was still breathing, would dismantle Elias Creed's empire from the ground up. He found the eastern end of the Arroyo Channel by crawling on his hands and knees through the dark, following the faint movement of cool air against his face, the way he had once followed the sound of running water through a complete whiteout in the Bitterroots. The channel ran roughly 40 feet before it hit an upward slope of collapsed stone and loose soil, not quite a wall, more like the geological exhaustion of ground that had forgotten to hold itself together over a very long time. Caleb pressed his back against it, drew both knees to his chest, and pushed. The first push moved nothing. The second shifted something deep in the stone. The third opened a gap the size of a fist, and through it came a thin thread of morning light, gray, flat, dry, and the most beautiful thing he had seen in his entire life. He worked it wider, pulling stone by stone until the opening would fit his shoulders. Then he pushed himself through into the Nevada morning like something the earth had tried to keep and could not, bleeding, filthy, and completely, furiously alive. He emerged in a stand of scrub juniper 300 yards east of the burial site. The sun was an hour up, flat and white in a sky the color of old bone. He lay on his back in the red dirt for 2 full minutes and did nothing but breathe and look at the sky. Not because he needed the rest, but because he needed the confirmation that the sky was still there, that the world above ground was still operating on its ancient schedule, that birds were moving and wind was running through the junipers, and the earth was going about its indifferent business without any acknowledgement of what had happened beneath it. Then he sat up and took stock. Wrists badly cut, needing binding before he lost more blood. Right shoulder took the worst of the drop and moved, but not fully. Ribs cracked on the left side. A white bolt of pain on the first deep breath told him everything. No water, no food, no weapon. He felt, underneath all of that, something electric and cold running through him like current through wire. He was not finished. He was, in every meaningful sense, just starting. He needed 3 things in immediate sequence before anything larger could happen. Water first. Blood loss makes thirst fast, and a dehydrated man makes slow and dangerous decisions that cost him options he cannot afford to lose. Cover second. Creed would send men to check the burial site by midday, and a man found walking open desert in daylight with bloody wrists and a limestone-caked face would have no further options of any kind. Information third. He had no idea what had happened in Harrow Flat in the hours since he was taken. Whether Wren was still at Mila Oakes's house on Crane Street, or whether Creed had moved her somewhere else entirely. Whether his cabin had been entered and stripped. Whether anyone in town had asked a single honest question or simply accepted whatever story Creed had already prepared and placed in the right mouths before morning. He moved east, staying in the low ground where the land folded enough to hide a man moving with purpose, heading toward the one person in the valley who might help him without requiring explanations he did not have time to give. Her name was Old Bessa. She was Shoshone, somewhere between 60 and 80, depending on who you asked, and she lived in a half-dugout, half-stone shelter in the canyon notch 3 miles east of Caleb's land, with 2 goats, several clay pots, and a knowledge of this desert that made every survey map in the county look like a child's first drawing. She had lived in that notch long before Harrow Flat existed and would likely live there long after it was gone. Caleb had met her in his 2nd year when she appeared without announcement at his creek and began gathering plants from the bank with the focused efficiency of a woman who has never once in her life asked permission for anything. He watched her from a distance for a full hour before deciding she was not a threat. She watched him watching her and decided the same. After that, a simple understanding formed between them. She took what she needed from the bank, and she occasionally left things at his fence post. Dried herbs, a cloth poultice, once a small clay horse that Wren had kept on her bedside shelf ever since, whispering to it some nights in a voice too quiet for Caleb to hear from the doorway. He reached Bessa's notch just before midday, covering the ground in a slow and deliberate crawl that would have humiliated him if he had energy left for humiliation. She was outside, at a small fire with a clay pot balanced above it, and she looked up at him with the expression of a woman who has seen men arrive from the desert looking like death before, and has made complete peace with the fact that it keeps happening. She did not gasp. She looked at his wrists, his shoulder, the limestone dust caked deep into the creases of his face, and said simply, "Sit down before you fall down." He sat. She cleaned the cuts with a wet cloth and the quiet economy of decades of exactly this kind of work, then bound his wrists tightly in strips of clean cloth. She handed him a clay cup of something hot and bitter. He drank without asking. Then she said what she had been holding since she first saw him crossing the scrubland toward her. The little girl. They moved her to Creed's place yesterday afternoon. Caleb's hands went completely still. He stared at the canyon wall, and something moved behind his eyes that Bessa would describe only once, much later, like a fire put out carefully on the outside but burning straight, through to the center. He set the cup down. He looked at her. And he said 4 words that told her exactly what was coming. "Tell me the layout." He did not move for a long time after she told him. Bessa let him sit with it, knowing the difference between a man processing and a man shutting down. Caleb was doing the former, working through it with the systematic thoroughness of someone who cannot afford to miss a single variable. His eyes were fixed on the middle distance. His breathing was controlled and slow. When he finally spoke, he asked two questions. First, was Wren hurt? Bessa said she had seen the girl from a distance as Creed's men moved her, and Wren appeared unharmed but frightened, kept in the east wing of the compound, which was used for guests and had a lock on the outside of the door. Second, did anyone in town know he was gone? Bessa said Mila Oakes had gone to the cabin that morning, found it empty, and spoken to Voss. Voss told her Caleb Durnard had apparently sold his land to Creed and moved on without saying goodbye. The town believed it, because the town always believed what Garrett Voss told them. It was less trouble that way, and Harrow Flat had always been a town that chose less trouble over truth when the two were in conflict. The rage, when it came, was quiet. That was the signature of Caleb Durn's anger. It never announced itself. No raised voice, no flushed face, no trembling hands. It settled in the way weather settles into a mountain range, slowly and completely, filling every hollow and ridge until the entire landscape was changed without a single loud moment. He drank the rest of the bitter tea. He rolled his shoulder through its full range until the joint moved with intention, if not full strength. He flexed both hands and judged what they had left. He breathed carefully around the cracked ribs and let them tell him his limits. Then he looked at Bessa and said plainly, "I need 2 days to heal enough to move. Then I go into that compound and bring Wren out." Bessa studied him for a long time. 8 men on rotation, she said. Creed keeps 2 directly at his door through the night. Caleb nodded. 1 man, she said. 2 bad wrists, a shoulder that won't be right for a week. He nodded again. She looked at him the way the desert looks at everything, without judgment or sympathy, with complete clarity. Then she said, "Tell me what you need." He told her. He healed as much as a man can when rest is never fully available. Over 2 days, Bessa's remedies, bark teas, poultices he couldn't identify, something she burned in the clay pot each evening that she had him breathe over deeply, were not miraculous, but were undeniably real. The wrist cuts closed and held. The shoulder came back enough to use with intention. The cracked ribs settled into a manageable ache he could breathe around if he was deliberate. He slept in short intervals and used the waking hours to plan, rebuilding Creed's compound from memory. The one visit 2 years ago, a meeting about water rights in Creed's office that Caleb had memorized the way he memorized everything, without knowing then why it would matter. In the quiet moments between planning, he thought about the small clay horse on Wren's bedside shelf, and wondered if she had it with her in the locked room, whether she was holding it in the dark the way she sometimes did when she was afraid, pressing it between both palms to make the fear smaller. Then the second night cracked open in an instant, a shape at the notch entrance, and Caleb's hand was on a stone before he processed it as human and recognized it. Deputy Holt Voss stood at the entrance, unarmed, hat in both hands, with the expression of a man who has made a decision that cost him 2 sleepless nights. He looked at Caleb, alive, upright, eyes clear, and something in his face briefly gave way before he pulled it back. "I thought you were dead," he said. Caleb said, "I know you did." A silence, heavy and full. Holt said, "I didn't know they were going to bury you. I thought they'd run you off. I swear to God, I believed that." Caleb said, "The girl. What do you know about the girl?" And the way he said it, not loud, not threatening, just direct as a plumb line dropping to find the floor, made everything else Holt was going to say stop completely. Holt told him everything. The compound rotation, the guard change times, which door connected the main house to the east wing, which of the 8 hired men were loyal to Creed by conviction and which were merely employed by him and would recalculate quickly if the situation clearly shifted. He spoke for 15 uninterrupted minutes, and Caleb listened to every word without once breaking in. When Holt finished, Caleb looked at him and said, "If you tell your brother I'm alive before I reach that compound, I will find you afterward. That is not a threat. It is information. Holt looked at the ground. Then he looked up, and something in his eyes had settled. Not comfort, not forgiveness of himself, but resolution. The look of a man who has chosen what kind of person he is going to be from this moment forward, regardless of the cost. He said, "I know what I am. I know what I should have done sooner. I'm doing it now." Caleb held his gaze for a long moment, then said, "Go home. Stay quiet. Be ready when it counts." Holt put his hat on and walked out into the dark. And in the silence that followed, Caleb looked at his healing hands and understood that justice, real, lasting, undeniable justice, was now exactly 1 day away. The morning before the rescue, Caleb moved through the outer edges of Creed's operation like a man who had memorized a building before deciding to burn it. He did not attack. He did not announce himself. He took things apart one quiet piece at a time, beginning with the water. Creed's compound drew from a diverted channel off Brindleback Creek, a diversion Creed had never legally acquired rights to, which was the root of the entire dispute. Caleb found the diversion point before noon, in a stand of cottonwoods 1/2 mile north of the compound wall, and he spent 40 minutes carefully rerouting it. Not stopping the flow completely, that would raise an alarm and alert every man on the property before nightfall. Just redirecting it enough that by morning the compound troughs would be half full, the horses restless, and Creed's men focused on the wrong problem entirely. He worked with steady, precise hands, and the whole time he worked, he was thinking about Wren in that locked room, counting the hours between them, measuring the distance in the way a father measures distance, not in miles, but in everything that could still go wrong between now and the moment he had her back. The second thing he did was the south gate. Creed's compound had 2 entrances, a main gate on the west side facing the road, and a service entrance on the south side for supply wagons. The south gate's stone mounting had been slowly cracking from ground shift for years without anyone noticing, because no one had ever looked at it with the particular attention Caleb brought to everything he intended to use. He found the fracture in the first minute, widened it with a flat piece of limestone until the hinge moved freely in loose stone, held in place now by nothing more than gravity and habit. He did not open the gate. He left it looking exactly as it had before. But now it could be pushed wide, silently from the outside, in the time it takes a man to exhale. As he worked, each movement pulled at the cracked ribs, and each pull brought Wren back to him, her face, the sound of her voice, the small tuneless hum she made when she was trying not to be frightened. He did not push the pain away. He used it. Pain that reminds you what matters is not pain. It is direction. The third thing required the most patience and delivered the most. He came around the north wall in the late afternoon, low and slow, and found the east wing's single exterior window, high, barred, facing open scrubland. He moved to it and pressed himself flat against the wall beneath it and listened. For a long moment, silence. Then, so clearly it stopped every thought in his head, he heard her. Not words. A sound he knew the way he knew the creek and the color of the Nevada sky at specific hours, the small, tuneless, half-conscious hum Wren made when she was trying not to be afraid. He closed his eyes and felt something move through his chest, like a door opening in a room that had been sealed for a very long time. He pressed his palm flat against the stone and whispered, quiet as breath, "I'm here, Wren." A pause. The humming stopped. Then, even quieter than his whisper, from behind 3 inches of solid stone, "Pa?" He could not answer again. He turned back to the open land and began preparing for dark, his palms still warm from the stone. The hours before midnight were the longest of his adult life. He spent them in the shadow of a boulder field 200 yards from the south gate, watching the compound's light patterns with the systematic attention he had given everything he had ever needed to survive, which windows lit, which went dark, which guard walked which direction at what precise interval. The rotation held perfectly at 30 minutes. The south gate guard was 19 at the oldest, watching the main yard and not the empty scrubland behind him, because nothing had ever come from that direction, and young men learned quickly to stop watching the angles from which nothing has arrived. At 10 o'clock, Creed's silhouette crossed an upper window of the main house, Tall, unhurried, a man taking his evening inventory of certainties. Caleb watched him cross the lit frame and disappear. He thought about Addie then, briefly, unexpectedly, about the juniper tree with no marker and the 2 days of riding with Wren on his lap, and the thing that had shifted in him that he had carried ever since. He thought, she would have known exactly what to do in this situation. She always had. He flexed his hands in the dark, breathed around the ribs, and waited. At midnight exactly, the South Gate guard walked his rotation toward the main yard. Caleb came out of the boulder field in a low run, crossed the open ground in 8 seconds flat, hit the South Gate, pressed his palm to the loose hinge, and pushed it wide without a sound. He stepped through into the compound yard, let the gate settle back into place, and stood absolutely still in the shadow of the wall for 3 full seconds, listening. The yard was quiet. 2 lit windows in the main house, the east wing dark and still. The covered walkway connecting them, empty. He looked at the walkway. He looked at the east wing door at its far end. He thought of Wren behind 3 inches of stone, holding the small clay horse in the dark, tipping her chin up. He moved toward the walkway, slow and deliberate, a dead man returning to collect what was his. And what happened when he opened that door, what Wren said in the dark before she even saw his face, was the moment that made everything he had survived worth every single cost. The news reached Elias Creed at 10:30 that evening, delivered by a pale-faced cutter man who had spent the afternoon at the burial site and found what no one had planned for. The earth above the arroyo had shifted. There was a secondary hole, small, pushed from underneath. Cutter had crouched at its rim, looked down into the empty cavity, and understood in one cold instant exactly what he was looking at. He rode back at full gallop and stood in Creed's office with his hat in his hands, saying the words with the careful flatness of a man reporting something he knows will be badly received. "He got out, Mr. Creed. The ground gave way below the hole. He's been out there for 2 days." The room went absolutely still. The mantel clock ticked. Creed sat behind his desk with a glass of whiskey he had not touched since it was poured. He set it down gently, precisely, and looked at Cutter for a long time without speaking. Then he asked 2 words, with the quiet precision of a man who understands that the next decision is the most consequential he has ever made in his life. How long? While Creed paced and calculated in his office, something entirely different was happening in the east wing. Wren sat on the narrow cot in the locked room with her knees pulled to her chest and the small clay horse pressed between both palms, doing the thing she had been doing for the past 2 days without stopping. Listening. Not to the guards outside the door or the voices from the main house, listening to the open scrubland beyond the barred east window, the way her father had taught her to listen to land. He had told her once, on a night ride back from Mila Oaks's, that the desert always tells you what is coming if you are quiet enough to hear it properly. She had been very quiet. Sometime in the last hour, something beyond that window had shifted, a stillness that felt occupied rather than simply empty. She had stopped humming. She sat with both hands wrapped around the clay horse and waited with her whole body leaning slightly forward, the way she always leaned when she was waiting for him to come back. Garrett Voss arrived 20 minutes after Cutter, and what followed in Creed's office was not pleasant for anyone present. Creed paced, unusual for a man who considered pacing a confession of anxiety, and worked through the variables with methodical grimness. Caleb Dern alive was a foundation problem. A dead man is a finished sentence. A living one becomes something else entirely. He had been buried, with bound wrists and cracked ribs, survived through geological accident, and had been free for 2 full days without approaching the law or appearing in town, which meant he was not running. He was moving toward something, and the something was in the east wing of this compound. "Double the men on the east wing," Creed said. 2 inside the room, not outside the door. Inside. Garrett nodded and moved for the door. Creed said without turning, "If he reaches this compound, we are finished. You understand that clearly." Garrett said he understood. He walked out to give orders, not knowing that Caleb had already been in the boulder field for 3 hours, watching every lamp in the building from 200 yards away. Cutter Main took 3 men and rode hard into the scrubland to find a man who knew that terrain by feel, by instinct, and by 6 years of daily contact. Cutter went south toward the burial site, and then east, covering ground with urgency and no real direction. 4 men rode out. Caleb was already inside. The south yard sat quiet. The main house burned on 2 floors. The east wing lay dark at the end of the covered walkway, 2 guards standing together at the junction door, talking in low voices, bored and not watching the shadows along the south wall. He found a loose roof tile on the storage shed, picked it up without sound, and threw it in a high arc over the far side of the yard. It cracked hard against the stone ground, and both guards turned and took 4 instinctive steps toward the noise. 4 steps was enough. Caleb moved up the walkway in the time it took them to understand that nothing was behind the sound, reached the east wing door, lifted the drop bar slowly with both hands, and was through before they turned back. The corridor held a single lantern at the far end. 2 doors, the first open, an empty storeroom, the second shut with a bar on the outside. He lifted it without sound and pushed the door open into a small, dark room. 1 suspended second of complete silence. Then, Pa. Not a question, just his name, spoken in the dark by the one voice that made everything he had survived carry its full and complete meaning. He crossed to her in 2 steps. She came off the cot and into his arms, and he held her with everything he had, both arms, cracked ribs and all, her body shaking with 2 days of held fear releasing entirely at once. Then the shaking slowed and stopped. She pulled back and touched his face with one careful hand, the cuts, the limestone still in the creases of his skin, and pressed her palm flat against his cheek and held it there. "I knew you'd come," she said. "I know you did," he said. He picked her up and she pressed his small folding knife into his palm. "Found it by the cot," she said quietly. "I kept it for you." He closed his hand around it and held it for exactly 1 second in the dark, but standing between them in open country was something Caleb had not planned for, and the confrontation waiting at the edge of the scrubland would bring every thread of this story to its final unavoidable point. The alarm went up 60 seconds after Caleb stepped back into the south yard, with Wren on his hip. He didn't know if it was the guards at the walkway door or a sound inside the room. It didn't matter. The compound erupted from silence to full noise in 1 heartbeat, shouting from the bunkhouse, boots on stone, a door thrown open somewhere behind him, casting yellow light across the yard. He moved for the south gate, 15 seconds before the yard filled, maybe less. He reached the gate, hit the loose hinge with his palm, and pushed it wide. He was through. He was in the scrubland. He was running. Wren had locked her arms around his neck and her legs around his waist, and was making no sound at all, not crying, not asking anything, just holding on with the ferocious, focused grip of a child who understands, at some deep pre-language level, that right now she needs to be as easy to carry as possible. She tucked her face into the side of his neck. He ran hard, burning through whatever reserve Bess's 2 days of remedies had built, spending every last piece of it on this single sprint toward open ground. He heard the pursuit organize behind him, horses pulled from the stable in the dark, hooves on packed earth, voices calling directions across the yard. He counted seconds, made the boulder field, and dove into the shadows between 2 large stones, pressing both himself and Wren into the dark and going completely still. The riders came out through the south gate, 3 lanterns raised, moving loud and fast, which is what pursuit does when panic has displaced tactics and replaced them with pure motion. They went south and then west. Nobody went east because east was empty desert, and a man running for his life runs toward people, toward town, toward light. A man running east is running toward nothing. Caleb had mapped this logic weeks ago without knowing he was mapping it, choosing the eastern approach precisely because it was the direction that made no sense to anyone thinking about him as a man trying to escape. He had stopped thinking about escape. He was thinking about after, and after was already taking shape in the dark around him. He held Wren in the boulder field for 20 minutes, breathing measured and slow, watching the lanterns organize themselves into a search pattern moving steadily away. Then he stood, repositioned her on his hip, and began walking east. The ribs pulled on every step. He breathed around them with the deliberate economy of a man who has made pain a negotiating partner rather than an obstacle. Wren pressed her face against the side of his neck and said quietly, "There were 2 men in the room with me. I pretended to be asleep for the whole 2 days." He said, "That was exactly right." She said, "I counted every time. They changed positions. I made a map in my head of when they looked away." He looked at her in the dark for a moment. He said, "Your mother used to do that." Wren was quiet for a second. Then she said, "I know. You told me." He kept walking and did not trust himself to say anything else for a while. The Nevada stars burned overhead in their ancient indifferent patterns. He walked. They had covered 2 miles when the single rider appeared from the north and stopped 30 yards ahead in the open ground. Caleb set Wren down behind him without a word, and she pressed her back flat against his and went completely still, hands against the backs of his legs, face turned toward the dark, watching the way he had taught her to watch, low and wide, taking in the whole picture at once. He looked at the rider. He had prepared for Cutter Main. He had prepared for Garrett Voss. He had not prepared for Elias Creed himself, a lone, gray horse, rifle across the saddle, composed in the particular way of a man who has decided that if something is to be done correctly, he should have handled it personally from the very beginning. Creed looked across the dark scrubland and said, "You are a remarkably difficult man to kill, Mr. Dern." Caleb said nothing. Creed's hand moved toward the rifle, and from 20 feet to Creed's left, out of the dark without any warning, a steady voice said, "Set it down, hands up, right now." Holt Voss stepped from the scrubland with his rifle leveled and his hands completely still. 3 of them in the Nevada dark, Creed on the gray horse, Holt with the rifle, Caleb standing with his daughter at his back. Creed worked through it with the practiced efficiency of a man who has never stopped calculating. He looked at Holt's eyes and recognized the stillness of someone who has finished arguing with himself entirely. He looked at Caleb Dern, buried, returned, standing here with a child against his spine and nothing but a folding knife and complete certainty, and understood that the geometry of this situation had stopped operating on rules he controlled. "This isn't finished," Creed said. Caleb looked at him for a long, quiet moment and said, "It is for you." 4 words. No heat, no performance, just the plain, complete certainty of a man who has been to the floor of things and returned and is done with the conversation forever. Creed's jaw tightened. He set the rifle across the saddle. He raised both hands slowly, and in the cold dark of the Nevada scrubland, the most powerful man in Harrow Flat sat with his palms open while everything he had spent a decade building came apart around him. The final reckoning, the moment that would define Harrow Flat for a generation, was 1 morning away, and this time the whole town would be watching. The trial of Garrett Voss was held in Harrow Flat's own courthouse on a Thursday in early April, and every seat was filled before the doors opened. People stood along the walls. People stood outside and listened through the open windows in the cool morning air. The town had not asked questions while it was happening, had not asked where Caleb Dern had gone, had not asked about the girl, had not asked what Creed's men were doing on the South Road in the small hours of a Tuesday morning. The town had looked away and called it minding its own business, which is what towns call it when they choose not to know what the powerful are doing to the quiet. And now the town sat in that courthouse and absorbed, one documented piece at a time, the precise cost of that choice. Holt Voss presented the testimony himself, standing in the same room where his brother sat at the defendant's table, not looking at the gallery, not looking at Garrett, just reading from the paper in his hands in a voice that did not waver once from the first word to the last. Garrett Voss was brought to the stand, the federal prosecutor from Carson City, a thin, precise man named Aldous Shear, who had worked cases across 4 territories with the patient, methodical thoroughness of someone who has seen every version of denial and is not impressed by any of them, asked one question first, not about the land, not about Creed. One question. Did you fill in the hole? The courtroom went so still that people could hear the wind against the building's outer walls. Garrett looked at his hands on the railing. He looked at Holt, who was watching him from the gallery with an expression that was not accusation, but was not absolution either. He looked at Caleb, sitting in the third row with Wren beside him, her hand in his, both of them watching without visible emotion. Garrett Voss, who had spent 15 years being Elias Creed's instrument in human form, who had delivered threats and buried a living man without changing his expression, said in a voice so low the stenographer leaned forward. Yes. One word. The gallery. Exhaled like a single body learning how to breathe again. Caleb felt Wren's hand tighten in his. He did not move or speak. He understood that justice is not always an explosion. Sometimes it is one word, spoken quietly, in a room full of people who finally chose to stay and hear it. The sentence was 7 years. Elias Creed was extradited to Carson City 3 weeks later, where a federal investigation, fed by a bank ledger that had been quietly recording payments to Voss for a decade, and by land deeds whose irregularities unraveled under careful scrutiny like wet thread, would occupy him for years beyond that. Caleb attended neither proceeding. He had said what needed saying in the scrubland in the dark, and he had no further interest in Elias Creed. What he had interest in was the cabin, which he rebuilt through the spring from the damage Creed's men had done in the weeks after the burial, stripping it in the flat certainty that nobody was coming back to claim it. Caleb replaced the roof, re-chinked the walls, built a new wide porch with 2 chairs. He worked with steady hands, and as he worked, the ribs healed and the shoulder came back fully by the end of the 2nd month, and when the cabin was done, it was better than it had been before, stronger in the places that had been broken, as things sometimes are when they are rebuilt by someone who knows precisely where and why they failed. Holt Voss became acting sheriff and then elected sheriff, which surprised some people and surprised no one who had been paying attention. He was not a perfect lawman, but he was an honest one, which proved to be rarer and more useful than perfect in that county. He came to the cabin once, in early summer, and stood on the new porch looking at the creek for a long time without speaking. Then he said, "I should have stepped out long before I did." Caleb handed him a cup of cold creek water and said, "You stepped out." Holt looked at the water. He said, "Is that enough?" Caleb looked at the land, the repaired fence running straight along the south boundary, the creek running full and clear, the watermelon garden planted in careful rows along the south bank by a girl who had been waiting to plant it for 2 years and had done it with the concentrated ceremony of someone who has been waiting a very long time and intends to do the thing properly. He said, "For some things, yes." Holt drank the water and rode back to town. He did his job from that day forward, and he did it well, and that was the only answer that the county actually needed from him. On an evening in late July, Caleb and Wren sat on the new porch as the sun went down behind the ridge and turned the Nevada sky the bruised purple he had last seen from inside a grave. The watermelons were coming in fat and heavy along the creek bank, exactly as she had said they would. Wren leaned against his arm in the cooling air and was quiet for a long time in the particular. Comfortable way children are quiet when they are completely, absolutely safe. Then she said, "Pa, are you scared of anything?" He thought about it honestly. He said, "Losing you." She leaned closer and said, with the certainty of someone who has tested a thing under serious conditions and found it solid, "You won't." He looked at the sky going dark above the land that 7 men had tried to take and could not, at the creek catching the last light below the garden, at the small clay horse sitting in Wren's jacket pocket where it had been since he found her in that locked room, and understood she had been carrying the same things he had, the small weighted objects of hope that keep a person tethered when everything else goes dark. He believed her. He had survived enough to know when something was true, and this was true, and he held it like the deed he had once folded into his breast pocket and carried across 6 years of pressure and drought and darkness without once letting go. That, right there, is why stories like Caleb's matter. Because somewhere out there, right now, someone is in a hole, not in the ground, but buried under a season of life that is pressed down hard and told them to stay down, buried under people who underestimated them, under circumstances that said, "You are finished." And this story exists to tell them what Caleb knew in that dark, with 6 feet of earth above him and bound hands and nothing but a hollow in the ground that nobody planned. Quiet people carry deep fires. The ones who survive aren't always the loudest. Sometimes they're the ones who know where the hollow ground is. If this story moved something in you, hit that like button right now. It takes 1 second, and it is the single most powerful thing you can do to keep stories like this one coming. If you want more, stories that hit you somewhere real, stories built to stay with you, subscribe and ring that notification bell so you never miss one. And drop a comment right now. Which moment got you the most? Was it Caleb breaking through the earth, Ren pressing that knife into his palm in the dark, or Garrett Voss saying that one word in the courtroom? Tell me below. I read every single one. And share this with someone who needs to hear it today. Someone who's being underestimated, someone who's still in the ground and doesn't know yet that they have more left in them than the people standing above them will ever understand. Tell them what this story says. They should have dug deeper. Western Tale by P.D.